And also we need to think of the longer term impacts of the crisis. So we're now establishing a program of Director of Town and Country Planning. We're going to start this with an international consultation, Luxembourg in Transition. We're going to go through scenarios for future developments and propose such developments for Luxembourg's future. This is going to be a framework for town and country planning that will enhance resilience and environmental protection. And we're going to have a conference next year to look at the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on our territory and our town and country planning. We're going to look at how to control mobility. We need to look at the real estate sector. What does it mean? How are we going to build in the future? What about Kirchberg? No, very few people are sitting in their offices today. And of course, the other challenge is how are we going to engage in trade and business? Some people have been big winners, and we have the acceleration of a trend that was already there, that is e-commerce. But what are we going to do with our cities? People have been saying for 30, 40 years, you need fewer shops in the center of town and more residents. But what is going to happen in the future? Of course, food and food production and supply will undergo great changes. And also, there's the great necessity that we do everything to ensure social equality and social equity. We need to think about how we build houses and apartments. We need to have people living in areas where they have access to high quality natural areas external to their houses and apartments. So we have more questions than answers at the moment. But in order to understand this situation and these challenges better, we're going to use this conference today to analyze what's happening. And we want to be as proactive as possible in the future. And we're going to use what we learn from this conference to look forward to future programs. And I hope the next 2.5 hours are going to be a helpful beginning to this whole process. We're going to deal with any technical problems in a moment, but I'd like to ask Josdel to address us second. Thanks very much, Claude Thomas, the Minister. I think this is a really great initiative to use a think tank to raise these problems. From the 17th of March, we faced an unprecedented crisis where everything was locked down and our activity came to a halt. We've faced a lot of questions like, are we all going to start remote working? What are we going to do with family problems? How do we remain in contact? How can we continue working over the next few months? So we have a whole basket of questions that still remain unanswered. So in the meantime, of course, in a sense, a lot of work sites have been opened. But Currently, the clouds have gathered again. We have both a health and an economic crisis. Are we going to manage this? Will we emerge from this next year? I just wanted to broach 4 subjects. First of all, remote working, construction and infrastructure. The remote working has functioned pretty well because it's possible to connect people with servers. But what happens with people who don't have good digital connections, for example? And then we've been able to keep the borders open more or less, even though we've been criticized for it. But of course, one of the big impacts is, and Claude Thomas mentioned this, borders are a problem, particularly for Luxembourg. So we need to enable our cross-border workers to be able to come to work. But we have, in some areas, in some sectors, negative signs. Most of the time, however, the borders have remained open. But we need to involve the rest of the greater region in solving the problems. And it's very important to keep this greater region functioning. It's not easy, but I think we need to rethink how we do this. I think that we can use this conference to start approaching these problems. Well, we need to also work out how people are going to be able to work better and work in better conditions. We need new ways of looking at things, new signals for the future. And so we need to use social media better. We also need to enhance the ways people can use digital platforms to communicate. And not be overwhelmed by false information available on social media. So we in the OIE, the Order of Architects and Engineer Consultants, have been very proactive in these matters. We sometimes had difficulty in persuading our political thinkers and to look at these matters from the way we believe is important. We need to encourage everybody to be part of this process. We need also to look at how we can renew and alter our procedures to help in this process. So we lost, of course, 6 months, but we need to rethink our planning procedures. And we need also to exchange ideas. That's what creative planning is all about. We need to discuss the possibilities, involving all the players and stakeholders. So that is a point that cannot be stressed enough. The idea that the market must, and only the market can decide what happens, is no longer an alternative. We need to review and reconfigure our ideas. And of course, independent planners need help, in particular from the administrations, because we have a whole reservoir of experts who can help in this task. But we also need to have recourse to our friends and experts across the borders. We need to bring Germans, French, Belgian, and Luxembourgers together to resolve these problems. And of course, we need to discuss the problem of cities, the city, and how it's been impacted by the crisis. Of course, the paradox of the city is that we have the biggest employment cluster in the whole region. But we have to try also to decentralize this employment cluster, because people are going to be living closer to where they work than has been the case in the past, and closer to where they buy their goods. So although remote working can't take the place of everything, it is there. So we need to change our habits and our planning to cope with this new reality. We may need to think of building offices in different places that will, in a way that will enable remote working. And you have to have spaces where people can withdraw and have peace and quiet to do their work in an office setting without necessarily being in the main or head office. So this crisis can be a way of initiating a new look at how we work and where we work. And it can provide us with a framework to engage in changes. It has the role of the state in all this, of course, has been raised. The city, rather, not the state. I mean, a city can be not just a place where people work, but where they exchange, where they meet, where they socialize, where they buy. So there are inherent conflicts here.
Politik als den gewissen Beschleuniger von Amazon gewircht.
I think that political dialogue, political action can be an accelerator in dealing with these changes as to where and how we live, work, and buy.
Staat soll ein richtig Staat sein und dürfen, wie der Claude gesagt hat, richtig dürfen.
So a city should be a city, a village should be a village, but they can each be rethought. I think we shouldn't just make this about Luxembourg, rather we should think about this on the level of the greater region. So perhaps the city can be a kind of assemblage of smaller villages where people can live and work in different ways. And of course, it matters a great deal what kind of life quality you have in both the city and in rural areas, and how can they be more approximate. I think that this is a concept that has been well known to urban planners for some time. And I think we need to bring together various social levels, various social groups in order to develop a common life or lifestyle model that includes everyone. I think that this should not be a moment of standstill, but rather a moment to take off in a new direction. And I think we need also to understand how we see our building culture, and to understand what living, residing, living in a house or in a public means. We shouldn't just be putting up massive buildings, but see what kind of buildings will they be? How will people live in those buildings? We have structural problems that need repairing, damage that's been done. We also need to be rather bottom up than top down, engage people, the recipients, the consumers of our buildings. And we need to bring Luxembourg together with the wider region. And importantly, and finally, we need political will to do all these things.
Voilà, merci, Herr Dell, für das thematisch auch schon eine Introduktion für die heutige Konferenz. Voilà, ich gebe dann nur
well, that was for the introductory session of this conference. And I'm just going to give you a rundown on the program. I'm Lex Faber. I'm going to be your moderator for today's conference.
Dann kommen wir zum Programm.
And the program is going to unfold as follows. We're going to hear Jean-Jacques Rommers and Pierre Haute. And then Antoine Decouville.
Then Christine Müller für den OAI.
Christine Miller is going to speak also to us.
Voilà. Den Emil Eichhoff als Präsident vom CIPU dabei und wir und dem Panel werdet eine Introduktion gehen von Marc Lemaire, den als
We're going to get, however, an introduction by Marc Lemaire. That's in our second session on the Sofia Plan. We'll be hearing also Claude Thomas again. The important part of this is how you, the public, are going to intervene. And so you should take out your iPhones and use the Slido system to tap into COVID. And you can put your questions to our speakers, so you can get answers to your questions from everybody who is available today. And you can see on your screen now the address at which you can join. It will take some time before all of this is translated. And you can use the Slido to take part in the discussions, pose questions, so not just join, but also take part actively using the slido.com address. I will pass on your questions to our panel members.
auch trotz der großen Unzahl von Leuten, die Heimat machen.
And I hope that we'll have enough time to involve everybody in our audience using the question and answer application for Slido. It looks like this is panning out well. So now I suggest that we begin our access to question and answer. We're going to have Kai Böhmer, who's going to speak to us on impact, on the territorial impact of the crisis. And he is going to introduce some of the subject matter we'll be dealing with today. And he's going to be speaking to us in English. I hope that Kai is on his microphone.
And thanks for the invitation, and sorry for the language confusion here. Talking about COVID and spatial planning or local planning, we need to be aware that COVID plays out quite differently in different places. And the impacts and effects that we see differ between regions, between cities, and even between neighborhoods in regions. And maybe I can have the next slide. And to understand those territorial dimensions of the COVID pandemic, we need to think of different elements of it. And if I get the next picture, we start with the outbreak that has quite a clear geography in different places and triggered healthcare and lockdown interventions of various kinds. And then again, those lockdown interventions created a geography of economic and social standstill. Even though that might be very similar over large parts of territories, what it really means, the actual impact differs quite substantially between places, even within villages, within cities. And again, those effects of the standstill triggered quite a number of recovery policy interventions. And as we will see over the next months and years, also those will have quite a diverse geography when it comes to economic and social restart. So I think for me, it is important that in the discussion, we are very clear that the pandemic has different territorial dimensions and we need to keep them apart. They're quite nicely mixed up in discussions usually. And if I have the next slide, you see just one of very many pictures at the moment where people try to depict how the territory differs when it comes to impacts of the lockdown situations that we have across Europe. And what is important, and if I get the next picture, is that we really differentiate here between healthcare and policy impacts. And this is an example of a map of a policy impact. And there it's important to distinguish between exposure and sensitivity. So exposure basically meaning, is my territory at all affected? Some territories have very little exposure, are hardly affected, and others are more. And sensitivity means, does that matter to me? If my territory is affected, does it matter to the development, to the opportunities of that territory? And that also, again, varies quite heavily. And of course, in the discussion of these aspects, we see differences between short-term, medium, and long-term. So those things, I think, have been mentioned already by the earlier opening speakers. And that, I think, we need to be very clear about in the discussions to make those distinctions. And in the next slide, you see a little bit, a number of aspects relating to the input paper that has been developed by Lex and his colleagues in preparation of the event. And the paper raises very important questions about the local development and what impact the pandemic has on places. But as we will probably see during today, the answers will differ for every place. So every place will see a different type of impact. And therefore we need to understand what a place-based answer looks like. And that means where happens what, or what happens where, and what happens in what type of places. And then, of course, in the second, how does that affect the flows between places? And starting points for such discussions are often where is kind of what kind of economic activity in a city or in a region or in a functional area, be it kind of healthcare having different impacts towards restaurants or restaurant, towards culture, towards shopping. And I think a number of those examples have already been mentioned. And that's when we look at the economic players, but then there are also quite a lot of people involved in that. And the part of where do people actually live? And also there we see a lot of differentiation across Europe, where we mainly look at, but also within countries and within regions, what kind of people are mainly living in what type of area, that still go to work, that maybe are more threatened through the pandemic, or that move to home office, or in countries like Luxembourg are not in Luxembourg because as cross-border commuters they stay outside the country, or as expats they actually decided home office in the home country is a nice option. I think all those aspects we need to really think about when we discuss the details of the questions that are raised for the local impacts of COVID and how we want to respond to that. And then of course think about what of the answers are short-term, what do we see right now, and what are aspects that will stay for a longer time, that will be with us maybe for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, or change habits and patterns completely. So from that side, I'm a strong believer that we need to distinguish much more clearly, not just saying a city is a city, a village is a village, but even different types of cities and different places within the city or within the village are affected differently, and we need to react to those aspects. And before I now use all the time of the conference, I think I hand back to Lex and come back later if needed. Thank you very much.
Vielmals merci, Kai.
Thank you, Kai. We are going to start with the first panel. During the presentation, there will be a question on Slido. Let's go to the next slide. You are going to slido.com. The question is, what is the level that telework will have after the crisis? Will it be more or less than before the crisis? We are going to get back to these answers after the speakers. Let's go back to the presentation, and we're going to give the floor to Pierre Hurt. 5 to 7 minutes introduction. The director is Pierre Hurt of OAI. What are the impacts from their perspective? I'm going to give you the floor, Pierre. Thank you, Lex. Let me put on my PowerPoint. Thanks. I'm going to be short, not to repeat too much. First slide. I wondered, what's the reason of this conference? Good question. Should we consider the social aspect? Is it sufficiently considered? One of the main reasons why to do this is because there is a weakness. A human weakness is not to share too much. Why wouldn't we like to share? You know the saying, everybody in his backyard, I want to ask everything. I don't want to have less quality. Only for me, not for the others. To be honest with oneself, we have lots of human weaknesses, and one of our forces would be, let's get a common value, and let's say sharing is enriching us all. It's an emotional debate based on verified public data, and that's important. We need facts, public facts that are accessible, to be objective. Such a debate like we have today needs to be objective. That's one of my main thoughts. Then let's go over to lobbyism, management of influences. This is a big problem. I try to summarize it today. We have a world financial and economic system that impacts 100% of our territory, our lives. A couple of examples: concentration, monopolization, practice of false free. What is that? Look at all the victims. Look, Facebook, etc. The system, what it is based on free access. But look at all these cars over the last 50 years. They dominate the market. Look, the food industry. That's some key words here. Ideally, we have to find an equilibrium, a balance, 50-50. So the context of the territory with its population impacts more or less 100% of the financial and economic system. That's a big debate. We will also have other conferences where we consider the social aspect. What would be the dream solution? An almost self-sufficiency of the community, where all the vital needs will be satisfied, but therefore have to be interconnected and open. And culture training is part of it. One positive message at the end: people are as they are, but sometimes the population understands quite well. Let's look at this KVE initiative. Most people understand the impact. Can we make the big groups responsible for everything? So that's the initiative of the people. The majority in Switzerland of the population accepted, understood the situation, and that's positive. And the last slide, I called it a good living together after or by coronavirus. Let's do it short here. In the middle, I wrote a sentence. Let's pay attention to the free riders. We have to draw the good, the best conclusions. People should not abuse. That's always a risk. And last idea that I have, you understand, we have to value everything correctly. Next slide. I do it very short here. We are in the process of doing a survey, a study. How can we do it in a circular economy? That's a huge challenge. What are the solutions that we have? Last thought. That's very important for me personally. We don't have to think commercially and industrially. And then we find our problem here that our member have an architect, an engineer. They have so divergent interests. We have to find a balance of people, of environment, of everybody. Therefore, it's important for us to have independent advisors without any conflict of interest, who can develop a concept together with people. Again, a summary, to make it short, what we need so that it can work, to get a quality of life, to plan for it and to get it. Therefore, we need a state that sets a framework. The civil society is important to give impulsions, also the free media. And then we have the craftsmen, shop owners and industrial players And we have the citizens that needs to accompany this independent advisor. Next slide. One message, I found it from what was written to me. Also for the sectoral planning, we have to get a better quality in our work, in our manual work. When we have to look at our legal framework, so it is important to have a framework to go into detail. We need a hierarchy, a global strategy. We need a real code of building here in Luxembourg. So we get priorities from the government, and then the actors of the sector, they need to be integrated when decisions are made. But the slides will be available for you. Let's go to the next one. This is a strong image that was given in 2014 to the government. We should not pass any steps. Every step should bring its best. Otherwise, we get conflicts. So there was an advice in 2014. We should not avoid any steps. Next slide. Yeah, we don't have that much time. Your time is over. 2 more minutes, please. So that's really an so our order was very active. We tried to unblock a lot of possibilities. What about the think tank? That's a document. It will come back in the debate later on. We are going to let these elements flow in the debate and also for the next conferences. One sentence that's very important. If we want to go ahead towards a circular economy, there needs to be this phase of conception. And if we want to build in a clever way, we have to look at the potential beforehand. We get help, we have our order, we have solutions on our website. Go and have a look. It's a tool to help that not everybody is working on their own. Everybody is important, also the administration. Next slide. We are almost done. Let's continue. Shortly. So this is too technical. Let's go further. So this is very recent. We work together with the health ministry, how to help us with the solutions to avoid such a crisis in the future. We work with specialists here, virologists, specialists of transmission of sicknesses by air. So we want our members to work together with all the different instances. This is one solution. We have to have a tool that is collaborative. MOAI.lu is a tool to optimize the collaboration between people. It's important that all this data stays in the public domain. We gather a lot of data. This has not to be commercial, but has to be public. We have already discussed this. We can continue. last saying, why do we need a resilient framework for our lives? We can never think in such a complicated way as it suddenly comes, said Willy Brandt. Let's stay bold. The crisis also reveals the best. I have tried to limit your time. It was not too bad. Before speaking with Jean-Jacques Romes, I give you the results of the question. What about telework after the crisis? That was the question. 2/3 of the people believe that it will be more than before the crisis, and some believe, 1/3 believe that it will be more than before the crisis. So this is the introduction for Jean-Jacques Romes's debate about the telework. He will give us his opinion, and this was already presented. It was presented to the employees, employers, and the state, so it's an opinion that's important. I give the floor to Jean-Jacques Romes, if he can switch on his mic. Thank you, Mr. Faber. Can you hear me? As said already, the Economic and Social Advisory Board deals with this. How come? We decided when I was the president, we decided to discuss the work of the cross-border commuters. And one of the subjects was also taxation, of course. And one of the subjects was telework in Luxembourg. Then came the COVID crisis, and it became a very hot subject. We had to discuss with the social partners, and the labor minister asked the Economic and Social Council for an opinion not only in the framework with the commuters, but in general, because it's an important component. What happened in this advice? We worked on this information. What you're interested in is what is telework, what's the volume, and what will it be in the future. And what I share with you now is what the social partner believe it is worth and what we worked on together. Immediately, I have to say that telework in Luxembourg was relatively high even before COVID crisis, because those 12% regular did already work remotely before. So, and some 20% already worked remotely before, less regularly. So Luxembourg is really at the top of countries using remote work. We can see that before the crisis already, we were already well equipped to work remotely, to do a lot of work. And this is also due to the nature of our economy, because we have lots of positions that can be worked remotely. And that's the only country in Europe where you can say that more than half of the positions can possibly be used to work at least partially remotely. But of course, everybody cannot work remotely. And there is actually a social fraction here. So the intellectual and scientific profession and the executives, it's 75% of the people who do telework, whereas unqualified workers they work much less in remote work. And this trend can be accentuated by telework. Therefore, let's keep in our head how far we can actually use telework. So COVID dramatically changed this situation. And in the first lockdown, up to 70% of the persons worked in telework. And up to 50% of the whole workforce did telework and did not go during some time to their office at all and worked only remotely. That's the figure. That means that our economical network, we have to get it in our heads. Half of our economy was suspended, was put in a digital world. And this also because we have this financial place here. So it gives opportunities to work remotely. So our economy resisted better than the one of our neighboring countries. Of course, there are sectors that are really hurt by this situation. But therefore, in general, we have a bit less loss of growth than our countries, neighboring countries, because we were saved by this situation. In the future, you know, we have launched kind of an accelerator by working more remotely. And some people loved it and will try to continue working remotely. But we are still in a situation that it's not normality. It's kind of a half normality now. So, and we are stuck in that situation now. And it is semi-normality. We noticed that telework has limits. Of course, there are lots of advantages, less trips, more flexible work hours. So sometimes it's easier to share private and work life, but it can also cause stress. So a better quality of work is possible. It reduces the cost for people, also for companies at medium term. And first inconvenience here, that is important, that's a social isolation. Mr. Dell has hinted at it. The exchange between people is very important. And all social partners are in agreement that we have to find a balance. It may be that telework works well for an individual, but we cannot, when we take a team and put it in telework, but we cannot create something immediately in telework. Because, you know, it's not possible to get a solidarity in the working space. We cannot have coffee together. And this is this has many inconveniences when it's about exchanging work, and productivity depends on exchanges, on creativity, on discussions. And all this is no longer the case. by remote working. So it's also a confusion in our private lives, and it has drawbacks. We have, of course, more autonomy for the individuals, and individuals are more responsible. And in general, there is an evolution in the companies because the hierarchy goes down, flattens, responsibilities are shared. It's a tool for managing time, and it's also about organization of work. And we have to think in terms of work organization, otherwise telework cannot work. The employers might complain that they lose control, but that was not the case so far. But this loss of control from the employer is actually feared. We can find, without a confidence, a trust relationship, telework cannot be performed. That's terribly important. And that's the fundamental limits of telework, and limits that we have to consider in the future. Second problem, it's legal limits. So we know that half of our workforce is cross-border, and there are tax limits. Apart from the COVID time, there are models that were found. Our neighboring workers can only, according to country, work a couple of days in this country for the fiscality. It has some inconveniences for our economic system. It is an objective limit. We know now that this limit was suspended during the COVID period, but they will be extended into next year. But it's only a temporary situation. So these limits play a big part, and also the one of social security. Why? Because when a commuter is registered in Luxembourg, social security, and works more than 25% outside Luxembourg, then he goes and has to have the social security of his own country, and it's more expensive over there. So this is a problem, and that means that the worker cannot decide himself freely, and also the employer will have to pay for the contributions of the place where the person lives, and this has consequences, administrative and financial ones. So 25% in telework of the work, that will be the limit. And there need to be bilateral contracts with the different countries, and this must be the basis for European regulation. So we need flexibility. There can be arrangements will have to be found. I cannot go to the detail now. So social partners and social security, they demand that the government discuss the tax regulations so as to fix this 25% for all countries. This will cost money to the Luxembourg Treasury to do it, but if we do not do it, then the frontalier, the commuters, they will do it themselves. just to tell you that you need to come to the end. Will do. Why do I tell all this? That's because we see that remote work, once when we go back to normal period, will not be determining. Overall, it will not be easy. There are limits. And why do the social partners do not order the right for it, for teletravail, telework? Last thing, the impact of telework on the national commerce, it is very clear that if only a fraction of the commuters will work one day only at home, then it is an impact on thousands of jobs here in Luxembourg. And that will cost a lot of money to the Luxembourg Treasury. And also lots of unemployment benefits. So for instance, in Kirchberg, we have seen that it was empty for some time. Conclusion, telework, yes, but that's what the social partners believe. And in the future, there will be not a final idea in the direction. Some points will be taken. It will be easier because not everybody will do the trips at the same time. But if we know that we had 7,000 commuters more per year, then this is a continuing problem. Thank you. The Romans will participate in the round table later. Now, before going to Antoine de Covid, there will be questions. Here are the questions. You can answer in different languages. Here are a couple of questions. We go over to Antoine.
Antoine, you are reaching us from your home, and this really fits in with the picture. Thank you very much. I'm hearing you very well. Could you please start my slideshow? Thank you very much for having given me the floor on this question of the territorial impacts of the health crisis linked to COVID-19. First and foremost, and not wanting to disappoint you, but it's a bit too soon to measure definitively the impacts on territorial planning of this pandemic. What I want to do is try to look at this from a different point of view and see how the organization of urban planning can affect our ability to resist this crisis and to deal with future crises. What we need to do is to move on from a defensive approach to a proactive, anticipatory approach to dealing with these crises. We need to improve the resilience of our urban planning. And that doesn't mean that we just go back to what we did before the crisis, but rather to learn from the crisis, to adapt our town and rural planning regulations to arrive at an equitable and resilient society. So what I want to do is to look at three levels, three spatial levels that need to be borne in mind. First of all, the cross-border level, the national level, and the local level. At the level of cross-border mobility, this is like an integration model. We're all part and parcel of one total area. But this makes Luxembourg a real example of non-sustainability. This is the result of a functional specialization of space with hyper concentration of employment in Luxembourg and making the rest of the greater region a kind of periphery where people reside. And everybody suffers the consequences. In particular, it renders us more vulnerable in the case of a terrorist attack, a pandemic, or the problem also of drawing in question the interest for cross-border commuters of working in Luxembourg. We need to re-look at this situation. Could it be that it will no longer be so interesting for people to work to Luxembourg? For example, some 50% or more of people working in health services don't live in Luxembourg. We should not forget how dependent we are in Luxembourg on people who live outside Luxembourg's border. So it's important, for example, to include these people in our urban planning, in our plans for constructing housing and the like. The second level that I wish to address this from is the question of national level, that is territorial planning, mobility, resilience in the face of crises. The reduction of mobility was one of the key means of fighting the crisis, but also it was an aid in fighting climate change and climate warming. So we've been able to see at a high level how remote working can be an aid in fighting, for example, global warming. So this experience has shown us the potential for remote working and the reduction in day-to-day mobility, cross-border commuting can have an effect on other problems. And if we have less mobility, less commuting, and we don't spend where we work, but rather spend at home, that changes a lot of things. This means that the provision of personal services and shopping has effects. So we might find ourselves in a virtuous circle of having people stay and work where they live. The state can also fuel that by working towards spatial deconcentration and moving things out towards the periphery of the greater region. And finally, with regard to the local level, I think it's important to see how this crisis has shed light on the lack of equality among people and how town and country planning affects this. We need to use territorial planning to have a favorable effect on the medium and long-term quality of life of all our citizens. We need also to favor proximity, to build recreational and creative spaces for all people. Also to render better access to natural areas in woodlands, etc., parks in close proximity, and to show respect for nature and to use the role of public spaces in an attempt to create better socialization and respect while respecting social distancing. So the question of housing is also fundamental because lockdown has showed the importance of having a balcony or a terrace in your house to provide a prolongation of your residential area to include outside areas. All of this, of course, goes back to a number of well-known principles of territorial planning. And I think that COVID-19 and its crisis has shown that the real need, the intense need to apply those principles.
Thanks, Antoine.
Thank you very much. I just want to come back to a question that's come to you.
Do you see any potential impacts that would be
which might
different in
differ
regions
from
according
region to region,
to the
depending also on the
economic
different social
situation?
strata
Or do you
involved?
believe that rural economy will take advantage
Or
of
can we use
telework?
remote working and the use of
Would
particular
there be an
specific
impact at a
spaces
higher
for
scale?
teleworking to address those needs? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question.
I did not hear the
What
beginning.
regions did you say who will benefit most?
If
Well,
we
no,
can
my
we
question was, can we differentiate region
region?
by region in terms of which region will benefit mostly from these changes?
It's not obvious to answer
It's not
to
an
this
easy question to
question.
answer, but I think this gives me the
It mentions
possibility
another question, the
to
question
bring up
about
an
residential
underlying question, the
preferences.
question of residential
What could
preferences.
happen in the
And
near
this is going to
future?
need to be addressed in
We said
the
a lot
recent,
that the health
in the
crisis
close future.
would be
We need to be
beneficial
able to
for
use
the urban
peri-urban
spaces.
spaces.
It's a
I think
hypothesis. It needs to be
we need
confirmed. We have to know
confirm that residential
the
preferences in Luxembourg
preferential
are in favor of
that the
outlying
preferences in
areas,
Luxembourg
areas on the
are
periphery of
in
large
urban
conurbations.
centers.
More than
Already
90%
years
of
ago,
residents who took part in this
90%
survey
of
preferred to live
people
outside
preferred
city centers.
urban living.
I think
So I
this
do not
COVID
believe it can
crisis
be
has
reinforced now during
that
COVID period.
trend, that tendency, that preference to live in
But I believe also
outlying areas.
this due to
But I
this
think the other thing
lockdown
that this crisis has shown us
situation,
is that we've sort
family
of shrunk
came
back into
together
concentrating
more,
on
and this could
the
have
family unit.
as a consequence that there would be a desire to
On the other hand, there's this
socialize
desire
more,
for
to have
socializing,
more
and the need also to
desire
be
for
in an
more
urban
urban
setting
life.
and enjoy exchanges of various kinds.
But that's a
So there's a
question that has
lot of
lots
things
of
we still don't
unknown
know, a lot of
aspects.
hypotheses in play.
I
I
would
don't want
not
to
risk
venture onto
to
that territory,
speculate in this area.
but I think there is a very strong
My role
attachment to
is to
life, as it were,
analyze the data,
and I think
so I
that
don't
I
want
wouldn't
to
want to go further than that.
forecast.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you
your
for that
answer.
answer.
A question on remote work. I propose to ask it to Mr. Romes. Please open your mic. Is there a difference between men and women for telework and also after? So the access to telework, is there a difference to access it? We didn't do a gender differentiation by analyzing this, so I cannot tell you. But it is teletravail is more useful in different types of work, and generally for the highest parts of the jobs in the hierarchy, scientific people, financial people, etc. We have up to 80% of telework, and it's less for other more manual works. So telework is an important aid, but not a target. Thanks for this answer. In the framework of your discussions, you have looked into the different firms. And did you get any answer from the companies on what was the impact? Please open your mic. This question is quite sensitive. In March, we did coach. It was very sensitive. In March, we looked at the situation, and regarding remote work, it worked quite well in general. But you know, for a creative process, you need physical presence. But we had a good reaction, and we made sure that the procedure would not block us. But this economical question is very sensitive, because this question that I've raised for the independent professions, these conceptors, normally these people do not work for help. It was a bit a step further to ask for help. But we found out, because we discussed this economic situation, what is an intellectual service worth in our society? So what's this intellectual independent worker? It is difficult for these jobs. So these 5 professions that are in our order, we try to live together with other players. If we look at the turnover, so we made a letter to the government. Many people were really surprised, because turnover in architectural offices per person is around 70,000. The answer that we can give to this, let's look together at the means that we need in this process. How can we use our means there? If we do it seriously, with resiliency, then we can come forward in this procedure. If our members can play a role together with the people, and with the government and with the companies. And I believe for this we need more means, if that's a question to answer. It's a good transition to close this panel. I thank all the speakers. I have to shorten it here. Mr. Romes will come back for the second panel, and also other representative of OAI will speak later. We break up and take your phone and look at the next question. What is the spatial aspect where the crisis had the most impact? You can choose here. And in 5 minutes, we will continue with our program. The time to get a cup of coffee. Thank you.
All right, let's get restarted. And I'm going to give the floor to Marc Lemaire. And with regard to the question we posed, you can see this on your screen. What's the biggest impact? There's a lot of people talking about mobility, but also commerce and the free market. Thank you very much for having contributed to our answers in that slide. And I would like to give the floor to Marc Lemaire, which is the beginning of the second panel. He is the coordinator for the Sofia Plan, and he's going to address us on this whole process on the basis of a few slides. I hope your microphone is now switched on.
Yes. Sorry, but I cannot hear. Je n'arrive pas à entendre le français, donc I switch.
I can't hear the French.
I just want to know if it's my turn to talk. That's it.
You have to you need to deactivate your translation and put yourself on the floor channel.
Voilà, vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me? Fine. Sorry about that. Technical hitch.
Voilà, on peut peut-être passer mes slides alors. Voilà.
Perhaps we can just put up my slides. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Marc Lemaire. I'm an entrepreneur, and I've been that for 20 years. We have, off the top, we have called Kaya and the Sofia Plan. 2 years ago, we established Kaya, which is a coalition of undertakings working for the ecological transaction. We're about 200 entrepreneurs here in Belgium. We're busy working for renewable economies, circular economies, and so on. It's one of the first federation of alternative entrepreneurs. And we established during the first lockdown this plan Sofia. When we had the beginning of our first lockdown in Belgium, we had really absolutely a blank piece of paper. The social media was awash with opinions. And what we decided was not to do and say anything, but think about this. And what we thought was really worrying was that most of the recovery plans established by the regional governments and also at the federal level looked like simply a return to business as usual. And we absolutely didn't want that, because we knew that a lot of money had to be invested, and we thought this was going to be a double whammy. We're going to have huge debt, which of course is what is happening, because a lot of money has to be borrowed by the government to manage the crisis. And then there's going to be also an ecological debt. We won't be working towards a Green Deal. So we wanted to look at the crisis and say, the utopians were those people who wanted to return to business as usual, whereas we felt that the alternative economics, like us, we were the people who were looking at this in a very realistic way. So what we did was to contact all the biggest scientific experts for the transition. A whole group of people, all the biggest names in Belgian science, both those Dutch-speaking and French-speaking, because our organization, our federation is a federal one. We're a bit crazy, of course, but we all began working remotely. And we had meeting after meeting, about 10, to establish not not a carte blanche, but a real plan with about 15 chapters, which concerned economy, agriculture, building, construction, tax questions, banks, education, culture, everything. And we had about 200 measures and about 50 pages. And we really decided to be totally participatory. We had 200 entrepreneurs and 105 academics. It was difficult to get there, but we got there in the end. And what's important is that when we broke this down into chapters, this plan, we worked on a systemic approach. Remote working, we said you can't deal with these things separately. All has to be linked. Remote working, ecology, global warming. So no, a problem has to be seen against the backdrop of all the factors in play, and we need to have this overall systemic type of thinking. We based ourselves on the European Green Deal totally. That budget that just was passed last night, so that huge 1.8 billion euros, 1,000 billion euros, it's been criticized in the press, it was this morning, but this is a serious basis on which we can begin this process. And we need to begin the political negotiations. And to do this, we need to look at the difference between people thinking in the long term and those who look at the short term, the latter being just to get an economic recovery, the others looking at a Green Deal. The short term must be in the service of long-term solutions. There has to be a long-term political volition because the short term serves the purposes of the longer term needs. There are economists who propose, business as usual, say there's no alternative to what we have now. Contrary to what we call the TINA solution, we talk about the plan Sofia. Sofia meaning, of course, from the Greek wisdom. So what we did, and of course I could speak at great length about this, but first of all, we met with the Prime Minister, Sophie Wilmès, and to our great surprise, mostly when we go with such a proposal, they said, go and see the president of the parties, go and see the ministries. But he said, no. We were asked to meet with all the presidents of parties, both the Francophone and the Dutch-speaking parties. Maxime Prévost, Paul Magnette, Elie Durupo. We talked with the Brussels government, and we're soon going to be meeting with the minister responsible for climate. What's important with this sort of inversion of the normal, all those ministers and political thinkers accepted our reversal of the usual plan. What have we done in the meantime? Well, a number of our group who produced the Sofia Plan took part in the Get Up Wallonia plan, that is the recovery plan for Wallonia. Of course, I could of course tell you about the process in greater detail, but I'm responsible for the task force on the environment. And I can't actually read you chapter and verse on the details of what's in there. But it's totally participatory. And one of the keys to success of any policy of transition is to work slowly, to hasten slowly, to work carefully. It's a bit heavy-handed, but it is successful in order to ensure a proper economic recovery. So we are now part and parcel of Get Up Wallonia, as planned, Sofia. We've gone from 15 to 17 separate subject groups, including culture and natural forests. We're now drawing up a budget for the whole plan. For 2021, we have meetings with the media once every 2 months. And we're going to have we'll have a plan, a federal recovery plan from Thomas Demeen, who is the right hand of Paul Magnette in these matters. And we do already have our differences with the proposed recovery plan at federal level. We've just contacted the Minister for Climate and Industries, and he wishes to, and Takir Katavi wishes to meet us. I don't want to continue with talking about the process, because when we're talking about territorial planning, what's important for us in Wallonia is to stop using the so-called concrete approach, which is to create concrete dinosaurs in agricultural areas. We've been able to take into account the needs of 25% of the population, and we need collective management of all construction sites, in particular in rural areas, in villages. Every construction plan has to be supported by the collectivity. We have to address and amend fiscal arrangements to be green fiscal arrangements. And we need to have proper green certificates accepted for all new buildings. And we want to create alliances for employment in all the environmental sectors. We need, perhaps unwieldy, but still important procedures which involve all the stakeholders on undertakings, government administrations, and so on, to provide for an overall philosophy and principles accepted by everybody involved, with the appropriate budget and a roadmap that is accepted by everybody. It takes longer, but once you have got that collaboration and that acceptance, you don't have this infighting between various factions. And another point which is really important, and I think it's important to pass as a message here, is that, and although we don't speak about this often, when we talk about reducing greenhouse gases, we know we get this reduced between 25 and 30%, but what we need to talk about is direct emissions. And this is the direct emissions that come from your operations. It's your, as an undertaking and individual consumption, where you buy your food and your products in your local supermarket. They don't come mostly from Belgium or Luxembourg. They come from as far away as China. So it's important to bear in mind that origin. How do you calculate that? Well, of course, you don't do it in China. For example, my computer was calculated in terms of its carbon footprint in China, not in Belgium. If we don't take into account indirect consumption, as if you were a minister, you'd say to you, ladies and gentlemen, go on consuming whatever you want because nobody's going to calculate your carbon footprint. You won't change the demand. Everybody's going to go on consuming because in political terms, there's no cost to it. What does that mean? That means that demand is going to go on existing and supply will be there to meet that demand. Once there's a demand, you'll have a supply. So for us, as far back as 2 years ago, when we began advocating these policies, we said it's important that we in Belgium act on indirect carbon emissions. You must know that in Belgium, they've finally been calculated, and indirect emissions are at least 84%. So indirect, 83% correction, 83% in total. Most of the carbon footprint in Brussels is an indirect carbon footprint. So we usually talk about our direct carbon footprint. We don't take account of all the rest. And so if we don't change our lifestyle, don't change the way we account for carbon footprint, we won't change anything. So if you're in an urban setting, your indirect footprint is very high. I'm not sure what this is in Luxembourg, but in Wallonia, we don't know it in Wallonia either. We're trying to discuss this all now. But what we do know, it's quite clear that indirect emissions are much more significant than direct emissions. And we absolutely have to include those indirect emissions, that indirect carbon footprint, when we calculate what carbon footprint we actually are emitting. And that's essential. Thank you very much, Mr. Lemaire. Perhaps just one closing question for you, if I may. You mentioned the global pact, but the process that you followed, what lessons, what consequences would you draw from your experience thus far? What measures can we adopt to make a change right here and now? Well, I believe, I think you have to just get out there and oppose. You have to be participatory. Get Up Wallonia is a good example. From the very beginning, when we met Paul Magnette, that was May or June, he put a lot of questions on the matter of participation. And we said when we launched Get Up Wallonia, it was going to be absolutely participative. It's heavy, it's unwieldy, it's tiring, it's exhausting. But what I'm seeing is that we're getting agreements between people who, if there weren't this participation and that approach, would not be there. There would just be unending fights. Via this participatory approach, we get to agreements. And a part of that, instead of saying what measures should we adopt, we should ask what hasn't been there, what isn't there. If we don't have a systemic approach, we can't do anything different. And that, I think, is the very basis. If we put that in place, work systemically, perhaps we can get to a result. Thank you very much. That would be a good way of continuing our discussion. And I think
I'm going to continue in Luxembourgish. We are going to start with the second panel.
And we'll just, however, pose a question.
Just a question before starting.
And we'll wait for your answers.
A question, and after that we are going to see a summary to see which of the topics need to be handled with priority.
But the question is now,
we
what
have
topic should we
already
just
some questions.
regarding
but we are going to make a
sustainable development.
synthesis. This question will be in the background and will continue to be
And while
asked.
that is ongoing, we'll go back to
So
our
you are
panel.
feel free to answer in any language. Let's get back to the slides. Second panel, Mr. Thomas, the Minister for Planning. And then we have Emil Aisha from CIPU, that's the communes. We have also Jean-Jacques Rommes, and we have Christine Müller, an architect and city planner, and the representative of OAI. For the moment, let's do a little discussion, a little tour, one after the other. Then we answer the questions. Mr. Thomas, to start, should there be a technical problem, let us know. I'm going to continue the question. In this society, did we show more solidarity? What's your thoughts about this? After Mr. Le Maire told us about the participative solutions, I believe that what we succeeded to do in the beginning of the year, March, April, we showed lots of solidarity. Question is, it's about taking this money that we are going to take loans, then give this money to sectors with less income. And how are we going to get out of this crisis? We have to be aware. We have also the climate crisis. It's much deeper, and we have to find also a solution to that one. And the rest of what we did here in Luxembourg, the relation with our country environment. And I tell you, because I work in a ministerium with a lot of figures, we have little persons in our workforce that is available. Also, transportation on a daily basis is not easy. Another example, in the future there will be people from anywhere to come to Luxembourg, and maybe they did not live in Luxembourg. And these people, on their place where they live, they have not the same offer, for example, for crèche, etc., that we have here. So here it's also about solidarity between those who are on the territory and those who are around in the greater region. And how can we solve this problem in the future? We have to extend this way to exchange in a clever way. A participative process, it's difficult today where you could not even shake hands with somebody. But I believe after summer we will be in a normal way, and people need to discuss together. They're very keen to do it. And we need to discuss what happened. So, since the Second World War, we had no curfew anymore. So as a society, we come to a phase here where we have to get together again. And we have this urge to talk together and to plan for the future. And we have to use it positively.
Ich gebe dann auch den Herr Eicher, ich höre nicht überrascht, dann ist gut sicher.
Mr. Aisha, I believe the technique is working here. Mr. Thomas hinted at the fact that the sanitary crisis is not the only problem that you have as communes. How do you see the situation of the communes in the future? What's the impact of the crisis? First of all, we have to get over this crisis. From March onwards, we reacted very quickly. There was exchanges from the first day onwards after our Prime Minister declared the first lockdown. We immediately constituted a WhatsApp group and we helped ourselves because we saw that time was flying. And we, between the communes, the solidarity did work very well. Everybody helped everybody so as to get used to this new situation. It has large financial consequences, of course. If we look at the financial plan up to 23, more than 1 point something billion less than normal. There will be direct effects. We have much less means to invest. Therefore, we have to think in depth how we are going to prioritize. And therefore, we offer to limit the consumption expenses so as to do more investments. Then we have to have the choice between investors. But very often communes have no choice because they don't have financial means to make large investments that would, however, be necessary. Most have difficulties to first meet the missions that they have for schools, infrastructure, etc. And then they have no means anymore. So because we have a big difference between the different communes, very small ones and then big ones, the city of Luxembourg has more than 1 billion euro as a reserve. And then we have communes have very few savings and have to handle the situation with their means. We don't want to make loans so as not as to charge the future generations. So we have to discuss new possibilities, redefine the roles, and give the means to the people so that they can meet their requirements. We are all committed also for the climate, as it was previously. We have made good experiences. Same for the housing. And we get some assistance from the government. And then there will be investments that we'd like to do to provide more quality of life. But we don't have communes that are structured in the main way.
Preise, den Axiologement sind noch wichtige Themen, die hier angeschaut gehen.
So accessibility to housing is important. Ms. Müller, you are working as an architect in conception also. What would be the impacts concretely? Which impact do you see and how should we react?
Die gehen am Moment nach mir klar. Und ich beschäftige mich also an unserem Büro schon
So
seit
I'm working in our office and I work with places where the sharing culture can be developed. The streetcar suburb, that's what took importance here in Luxembourg because of an unhappy situation, all these little communes that without wanting it contributed to a situation in which we had a mental health problem here in Luxembourg. We want some mixity, but we have no culture of tolerance here. The tolerance that we need is that we have some indifference regarding the difference. And that goes through all the sectors, also in architecture. This crisis is something that sharpens the problems, but it's an opportunity to get renewal and to change the society in a positive way. The cities needs to be more urban and the countryside more rural. And we have to work. I think most people have the potential to go there. We can help to get into that situation. We don't need all the luxury. What is necessary is to be together, not only to drink and dance, but that we live together and think together about the future. We have a very nice opportunity here. We have lots of cultures. They're having lots of dialogue. That's favorable. I'm not very pessimistic for our future. So that's good. So let's finish the first round with Mr. Romes. Lots of the big part of the economy resisted well. So what would be the sectors that could benefit from the crisis? And what sectors could you develop in the future? I don't see any sector here in Luxembourg for which we can say that it benefited in Luxembourg. Those who benefited is remote commerce, e-commerce, international groupings, but I cannot say that here in Luxembourg. You know that HoReCa had lots of problems. I cannot say that the financial sector has benefited. So we feel the repercussions. Nobody benefited, but Luxembourg works with an economy that is not for our national market. We have services, and our market is outside the country. And those who work for this market, so it's a sophisticated service sector. And that's the one who resists best. So that's quite an opportunity because this sector can work in a digital way. So that nobody is benefiting here. But we have a problem, big problem. Because of the expenses that that we have now will take away opportunities for the future. When we say, as Mr. Thomas, that this crisis is a small one compared to what is expecting us on the climate and ecological perspective. So which companies do we have here that can lead and pay for this? For the moment, it's only those that I quoted who resisted best. We have to be aware of it. Otherwise, we will not be successful. So always we have this dilemma. Shall we get back where we were? But it's difficult to get out of this. We have no anti-cycle policy before. We have few savings. We have to try to make a change, and that will not be easy with these players that we currently have. The greater region is also among the players. We talked about this, the housing crisis. Many people go and live outside the Luxembourg borders. We talked about social securities. So what's the importance of the greater region now? And what should be the importance of the greater region? If we look at the situation, I think we are in a good situation because we have facts. We know how many, what is the workforce in the greater region. We have good databases. That's the result of our project that we are soon going to close. I'm going to discuss with the minister of the different regions. And we are going to set this master plan and different plans also we are going to decide. We have a good basis already. On the other hand, here in Luxembourg, we're happy to have the cross-border commuters. We have had them for long. It takes time to get to a different policy, to a functional policy, to get more structure into this. And to include it in the master plan of the different countries, because we know that part of our economy does not stop at the border. We have this project, this new project, and we have selected 10 teams, international teams, and Luxembourgish teams. We told them that we have to reflect about a spatial dimension of a resilient economy and a climate-friendly economy. So countries are not borders, there's a functional area, and we did it on purpose. So these 10 teams now exist. We are going to make a conceptual exercise. What are we going to measure in this period of climate protection? This is until end January. And then we reduce these teams to 6 to 3 to give a precise idea what the spatial dimension of a climate-friendly economy is. And this is beyond the borders. And in this consultative committee, it's not only Luxembourg people. We have these different organizations, StatTech, Civical, but we also integrated our neighboring regions into this exercise so as to have a vision to get in the direction of the future. Include this greater region in our planning. And as a minister for this, I think it's a bold exercise. You have to know how to come there, to discuss with all the players so as to get a good base for this with all the players. So we are in a type of economy that is very Europeanized, and it is the desire of the people to focus more on the local perspective. We created something that doesn't exist, that didn't exist so far. We get a representation of the people by having 30 citizens who live in Luxembourg and beyond the border, Europeans, non-Luxembourger, living in Luxembourg and abroad, to have a committee and to have a good opinion of what people think. And we have this committee where with all the different players and an interministerial committee too. This concerns our whole government so as to get a resilient view for a resilient Luxembourg.
Yes, this is a relatively complex process that you're describing. And I think a lot of people who are listening today are involved. Can we get a short-term input for what's going to happen after the crisis? Well, I think if we look at what is being written by international territorial planners, Foster and so on, what Ms. Miller said as well, we have to establish platforms where people living in a place can be involved. It's a question of deciding what you want and what you don't want. So do you prefer to have parking spots or a place where you can sit down and enjoy being outside? And the other thing is about mobility. Just the fascination of being able to ride so far on my bike, and now my electric bike, that is something that's going to play a part here. It's a central question. I can get two wheels, one wheel, skateboards. They're just this sense of being out and about. You can't be on the pavement though. You've got to find solutions for shared space for these new types of mobility. And that has to involve people and their views. And you have to be able to criticize. And also, we might need something in between remote working and office working, and something about co-working, where lots of spaces are available. So you could have something in between, and depending on where they're situated, you can get changes happening quite quickly, really, and that can be part of the solution to the crisis. I think now we could have a look at what you're saying on Slido. And I think we should broach one point that has been raised, namely the autonomy of local authorities, because they're the people involved with the grassroots and about doing something about this in practice. And I think that local authorities need to perhaps work together in order to deal with these problems. And perhaps we can hear this from Mr. Eicher. Yes, I think that all crises provide us with opportunities. And I think the local authorities can play a role here. And for example, I've had whole local authorities where everybody was ill. So I think they're going to be a key player, a key stakeholder in anything we do that's new. And I was interested to hear what Ms. Müller said, and I can confirm what she said. We had discussions with other small European countries where we were looking at how people were getting on who wanted to engage in sporting activities. And what we found was that in all these countries, people living in urban areas discovered nature and the beauties of nature, walking in the woods and so on. And I think this is going to stay with us, and we have to profit from that sensibility. And the idea is also that people like to move when they go out. I think you mentioned that. I'm not just speaking about Luxembourg, but when I think about people in northern Italy who were locked in their flats for weeks and months, I think it's really important that you see green when you look out of your window. And people are looking for freedom, they're looking for contact out of doors. And with regard to active mobility, I think the local authorities can do a lot to establish, for example, cycle paths. And this, of course, can be done in cooperation with the state. And I think there's a great potential for that kind of progress to be made. You talked about mergers. Well, we've always supported and advocated fusions, the mergers of local authorities, because it's been our experience that that is positive, that mergers of this kind worked out well. And we've informed our local authorities too that the problem remains that when everything is working, then people say, we're right, we're fine by ourselves. But of course, if you get into a very different situation where there are problems, and then of course, it's not so easy for individual local authorities to operate. And I think today I had two local authorities on the phone talking about possibility of merger. And I think this is the time to send a signal and for the government, for example, to enhance its financial support for such mergers in order to provide incentive for various local authorities to get together. Some people have been saying we couldn't manage the crisis as well as we might have. Others would say, but we were resilient, we could manage. But in the case of smaller communities and smaller local authorities, the danger that they won't manage is much greater. Of course, you can use a whole variety. The larger local authority, larger areas, suburbs and so on, can do a better job. They've got more people they can rely on, engineers and so on. But I think this merger and this bringing together of local communities is going to be one of the keys to success. That seems to be a good message from the circle of local authorities. Coming back to remote working and some of the acute questions, perhaps we should go back to what was said before by Mr. Romis about remote working and how various sectors are so different. What can we do to facilitate that remote working? And of course, we've got these social disparities between various sectors and population groups. Well, let me try to answer your question, but let me just say when I look at what you got on the Slido, it's not just enough to say we must think as one greater region. That doesn't happen by itself. You need governance. We also need an economic project for the greater region. We mustn't forget that a lot goes into making that a reality. We can't just live from, for example, repairing bikes. We've got to get new business projects, and we have to do this as a collective effort. With regard to remote working, obviously, we could, of course, decentralize work and send people back to the greater region. And remote working is only one means of dealing with the crisis that we've had. We can't just we can't make these problems vanish. Some jobs don't involve or don't require remote working. We can't just totally transform those jobs. There's a lot of education and so on that goes into making people who can do remote working. Of course, we're fortunate that we have a lot of people who are well educated and can enjoy the advantages of remote working. And we need to adopt other measures in order to iron out social disparities. But we can't totally make everybody equal. And this is why trade unions aren't just advocates of remote working. Because those differences have to be taken in advance of this goal, because remote working is also a form of inequality. Christine Miller. Given that I live in Kirchberg, I can imagine what that means. But why can we not generalize this? What are the challenges in terms of town planning that face us when we want to extend remote working? What are the challenges for architects and interior designers and so on? Well, for the city of Luxembourg, there has been an impact. If you look at the way shops have had to be closed in the city, remote working has simply reduced the number of people in town. We have a total disequilibrium between office buildings and shops, and almost traumatic for people living there. And so here we need to develop other solutions in order to make various areas of the town, various quarters, various suburbs, places of meeting. We have to establish microcosms. Talk to people is the solution. We need to use that in the cities. We need to have people who are equal, who can address each other as equals. Remote working, of course, provides chances, but it can't be the sole solution in terms of our cities. What I think of as very positive is how we see small initiatives have been supported by the city of Luxembourg. You might see it as a mere bandage, but we've got small undertakings who have shown real courage and have tried to bring back life to the city. And I think that must be supported as it is by the City Council. And I think we need to create, as I said, a virtuous circle. Of course, when I read in the paper that a piece of land is disappearing, we need to see how we deal with that kind of problem. So we have conducted a workshop with traders in 2004, and they were asking that very question, where greater concentrations of buildings is going to leave no place for smaller shops, and that would not be, they said, good for the city. So I think we've come to a break-even point where, with a lot of goodwill, our sense of improvisation, which is really congenital for us, can help us to move in the right direction. And I just want, somebody mentioned also one of the mayor's observations about how you use the central parts of your cities. So e-commerce, e-trade is not new, but it's just been accelerated by the crisis. What measures can you adopt to deal with that? Well, we have a crisis which has been exacerbated by COVID because many banks have withdrawn, shops have closed, and nobody replaced them. And there was no possibility of resuming their activities. And we don't want to see an empty Grand Rue. We now have a group called City Management, which is trying to bring traders, retailers together and try to find people who want to resume their activities. And also to find other openings outside the city to provide for financing and subsidies when dealing with problems facing retailers in the city. But it's very hard to fight against the current trend, whereby it's much easier to build a big supermarket outside the city limits rather than setting up a smaller retailer in the city. What we have to do is to find those undertakings who are willing to set up in smaller premises. They don't have to be very specialized. We had a shop which closed up a few years ago, which was specialized in products that drew clients from throughout the grand region, the greater region. So there are ideas out there of undertakings or retail businesses that could survive. You just have to have the right ideas and the right people. I think you probably have to concentrate on services. If you want to bring back life to the cities of the street, the streets of the city, rather. So you should not underestimate e-commerce. They've just had a huge impulse this year to grow their businesses. And I would also like to thank my colleague, Thomas. When we think about economy here in Luxembourg, I think we have to think beyond the bounds of Luxembourg itself. Europe, for example, has proved itself very vulnerable when at the beginning of this crisis we had no access to supplies of medications because a lot of this had been moved to China. And I think we just missed the boat on that. And I think it would not be a bad idea if we, for example, put up the money to attract suppliers and manufacturers from not just in Luxembourg, but all over Europe to provide for those undertakings of which we have bitter need in a crisis like those manufacturing medications, for example. Mr. Romes, would you like to come back on that? I think that's absolutely right, but it's a very complicated topic. Yes, I think we'd be better off buying our needs from near rather than far. Of course, we've got Cargo Lux, and they were in a panic when we thought we had to close the borders and we couldn't get disinfectants from Germany or anywhere. So for us, proximity means the greater region. And that has shown itself not to be totally reliable during the crisis. We need to think of the greater region as a complex whole, and it is a complex whole. So I think that's what's emerged from this crisis.
Vielleicht Herr Turbes, ja? Und dann Christine.
Herr Thomas and then Christine Miller after.
Mikro nach ummachen?
Can we get a microphone for Mr. Thomas?
Phänomen, wenn viele Leute gleichzeitig klicken, nicht ganz klar aus. Wie
We have this problem, there's too many people clicking the button at the same time. Yes, but paradoxically, the greater region was not Mainz or Trier. We weren't the only ones. In fact, Berlin closed its borders against the desires of the population. And then, of course, we had an agreement between our prime minister and the French prime minister not to close the border between Luxembourg and France. But the difficulty is that you've got decisions being made in Berlin, Paris, and Luxembourg. They don't see the greater region as we see it. So we need to have a common vision, develop a common vision with people from the greater region, and then sell that to the big people in Paris and Berlin. And going back to Mr. Romes, yes, of course, we make certain things locally, but our success comes from our global attractiveness, which lies greater with services than with, for example, the pharmaceutical industry. But I would like to put a question. How do we get somebody from far away to come to Luxembourg when we a high quality of life, not just limited, not just to Luxembourg, but that is functionally larger. I think that's part of the policy that needs to be there. I think it's encouraging to hear what Emil Eicher said and what Christian Müller said. We want to be a window of opportunity to deal with this mismatch between the auto-dominance of certain businesses and the tendency of certain sectors to destroy milieu and draw on the multifunctionality and the social charter of Luxembourg and its surroundings and the greater region. And coming back to Mr. Romes again, the analysis made of the business world, how optimistic are you that we're going to get or retain shops in town centers vis-a-vis the enormous large supermarket and shopping areas outside the center? Given the time, I'd like to give Christine Müller the chance to make another contribution. Do I have the micro? Yes, yes, you do. I just wanted to open a bracket, if I may, with regard to what Mr. Eicher said about the commercial streets turning into deserts. Obviously, we have fewer large families these days, but we also have a public sector which is also engaged in disloyal competition with independent providers. It's maybe not intentional, but the fact is that independent undertakings are losing people. If we want to create diversity, which is so important for our quality of life, we have to understand how we're going to provide incentives for people to make startups and become independent entrepreneurs. Because we have to look and see how well are they earning by comparison to salaried workers, for example, and the state's role in that. Something from Mr. Romas. Well, all that we've said about independent undertakings, I can just say what has emerged from the crisis, namely that this crisis has been devastating for independent entrepreneurs. So we need to work at that. And this cleavage in this country between those who are doing well and those who are not doing so well. And in that discussion, independent entrepreneurs belong in that discussion because they have been virtually expropriated, lost their earning capacity. And just on the quality of life, I want to say, when we're talking about quality of life, we're not going to attract people. We can keep people here who've already come here.
So
we haven't got a good hand to play. We need to emphasize our other attractions. We do have other attractions, but we need to work hard at that. We need to make Luxembourg more attractive to undertakings. They can't be so enormous that we can't house them, we can't host them, but we have to make ourselves attractive enough to attract. We need to look at our procedures in order to make Luxembourg attractive enough to bring new undertakings here from abroad. Mr. Eikes, yes, I just want to link up with what Mr. Romas said. That's exactly what we're trying to do. We've insisted that we want to do everything to provide incentives for European companies to set up in Luxembourg. We often forget that we do have qualities here that make us attractive. For people who are coming to Luxembourg from abroad, especially from the further abroad, we have a large number of small undertakings of foreign origin. And most of the local authorities have undertaken initiatives to provide such incentives to support, for example, local traders in their areas. And for example, the whole campaign to provide incentives for local tourism. And to provide incentives for people, for undertakings to keep going.
Wat dafür Daylight extrem frustrant, dass hun Licht um Tunnel gesehen, sich immens zugehen für
I think once you see a light at the end of the tunnel, you need to bring into action all those measures that can aid the economic recovery. And how to maintain independent businesses, especially small and medium-sized undertakings. I think we must provide added value for these people to come here, set up and provide services. And there must be recognition for independent entrepreneurs to come and set up. Thank you, Mr. Eichel. And given that time has got away from us, and this is a crisis that's been here a while, and it's not going to be finished a while, but I think that this conference has been useful, and I think we could end this conference by a note relating to the international ramifications of the crisis.
Well, thanks.
Mr. Burma.
Yeah, Alex asked me to reflect a little bit from a semi-inside, semi-outside position on the discussion we had this afternoon, and I have basically 5 points. So first point is a little bit the topics. We started off quite heavily with home office, but the discussion showed that COVID responses go far beyond that. We talked a lot about environmental and behavioral changes, mobility, housing, commerce, entrepreneurship, cooperation of local authorities in Luxembourg and beyond borders. At the very end, now tourism came in, and for me, I guess also business travel would have been a topic I expected, which didn't come here. But for the second point, all of those topics, when you listen carefully to what has been discussed, there's always an underlying risk of increasing social and economic inequalities that come with all the changes we see to COVID. So there was a lot of those disparities that are growing, or fragmentation, as we tend to say. And that is also fragmentation within Luxembourg, but also fragmentation within the greater region. So there are a number of different geographical scales of that, which leads me to the third observation, which was in the middle of the discussion quite prominent and phased out again, is the recovery process. Whether it's a recovery or a new start after COVID is a missed opportunity, an opportunity to move towards a more sustainable and resilient Luxembourg or local development. And here there were a number of things also saying we need to prepare for the next big crisis related to climate change and biodiversity, and maybe see what lessons can we learn from the COVID experience that we have made at the moment. But we have also seen in the discussion that whatever comes next will have to deal with less public money. So tax income is most likely to decline, which asks for a higher priority setting, which of course becomes difficult if you then also want to move towards a sustainable and resilient society. So really the way how we set priorities might be the key to a successful recovery, if I listen between the lines to some of the statements. But there was also, for me, a message that we need more experimentation. So there is kind of not the one blueprint, but we need to allow and test different things and do that at different scales, from the very local to regional corporations to national to greater region or beyond. And in a number of statements, it was also said we need participation. It's not something that is driven only by experts, but we actually need to do that in a participatory approach, and we need to have a broad debate, and partly we are already having that in different scales, but maybe that needs to be accelerated. And the last point is basically for me the question, how then better spatial planning can help. So all those very broad, very substantial parts pose also the question, what can urban or spatial planning do? And coming mainly from the European level, I think there is a slide. I just would refer to kind of 3 documents, 2 of which Minister Turmers and his colleagues agreed on last week, so they are pretty fresh, which are the Leipzig Charter and the Territorial Agenda 2030. And I think they contain a lot of ideas for a more strategic or spatial planning or development policy that can help to phrase a recovery and prioritize in that recovery process. And then there's also the Committee of the Regions that actually has done quite a number of studies on the impact of COVID on cities and regions that go a little bit in different directions, in particular when it comes to the economic part, going a little bit deeper. But I think there are a lot of hints in there what can be done in order to use the opportunity that the recovery brings. And then, of course, the question for me is there something that CIPU can do next year to facilitate or accelerate that discussion? And I think that were my 5 points I took home from this very interesting discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Merci Kai, vielmals merci. Ich denke,
Thank you, Kai. Kai hinted at the fact that CIPU will work on this later on. We have 3 conclusions, short conclusions now. The OII and Mr. Thomas. First, Mark Fiber, I hope this will work from a technical perspective. So we did not find Sala. She is the General Secretary of OIA, and she will draw conclusion. Thank you. So I'm going to speak first. I believe that today we are all aware that the crisis has different impacts, but also has revealed many urgencies, emergencies, and problems. And what we see a lot in discussions is that people are more and more aware that of the problems that have become more visible. And I think that's the reason for this conference. And that's a very important point for us. All those working as planner, or the politicians, or those who work at national level. We have to have more dialogue and develop more strategies. I believe we said today that we are at the very beginning. It's important to create and to maintain this awareness. There might be some fatigue among the people. Some people want us to go back to the previous situation. We understand this. It's also a certain danger that we are not going to succeed to learn out of the crisis. So that's an effort that we have to make in the time to come and also after the crisis. So we have to learn the lessons from the crisis and set up new strategies. And of course, we tend to forget what happened before. Our duty and the duty of our member is we have to work together with social engineers and work at all levels, at the think tanks, but also on the concrete level with communes and with the government to develop new strategy. There are lots of reflections that are done now And what is important, and it was said several times today, it's think great region and get aware of this complexity of the greater regions. So we have to work interdisciplinary way and also with our fellow citizens to do that national planning. So we have to get the input of the citizens. So we believe that the crisis has a positive impact because everybody can be included in this. I don't want to make it too long, but we are facing a very big complexity. And we will be happy to have a next round table. I believe Mark Feider has arrived. I will give the floor to him. Okay, because we did not find him. Oh, here he is. So let me present him as the Vice President of the OAI and also President of the Sustainable Construction. Good afternoon. In the beginning, it was said that this roundtable should be kind of think tank. That was the role. As the previous speaker said already, I want to add that this National Council of Sustainable Building, the idea is to be resilient in healthy constructions, to look at local economy also and use our local workers, and act against the idea of climatic warming. This crisis showed us that if something happens, if we have these negative sides, they are put into evidence and we have to be very resilient. So the changes are possible. We could take it as an opportunity, as Mr. Thomas said. So we are not back to normal world as it was previously. So I want to close with that. Everything has been said. This was very interesting. And I believe everybody can take home some elements. Thank you, Mark. Mr. Thomas, you are ready for the final conclusion. Just a scoop for this vaccination. We have a little input, creative impact. So I'm happy that we have a consensus for lots of things. We have to think cross-border and include the greater region for political reasons. We are in agreement for the new city, a new mobility in the public space. This semi-public area is important by planning new areas. How are we going to fill this with life? With shops, less offices, what will come to town? We have to fill these rooms, this place. Mr. Aisha said it's maybe the moment for the communes to work together. We are working on the Luxembourg structure. We are looking where the strengths are. So more communes seem to be ready to merge. I want also to tell you about this work we do for the new big areas like Ash. We have new planning, like in Esch, where as part of the center is outside. So we have these new areas made in Luxembourg. The most important from today seems to be the dialogue. And what I plan for the future is that the upcoming planning in the master plan, that I wanted to do it together with you. And therefore we tried to have lots of possibilities where to talk. There will be different possibilities, and I want to work with the OAI in the same context as now, to have it in the future, to use this dimension of good quality of life and discuss about it. And of course, thank you for Mr. Böhmen. We have a couple of documents already. This Charter of Leipzig, for instance. It's a detailed document where part of the answers flow in. We can look at this together with the CIPU to work around this. And last point, this contribution of Wallonia, of Mr. Lemaire. It's important to discuss and dialogue, and that we go beyond that, to get out of what differentiated us and to do something together, have common visions, and to be in agreement on a large scale with all the players, so as to be able to progress more quickly. We should not restrict each other. That would be my wish, that this city planning, that around this subject we have to have a consensus. Thank you. It was a good conclusion. Normally, one should not speak after the minister, but I just want to tell you how to close. So in the Slido system, you have the possibility to give your ideas over the weekend. We leave it open, so you can do it tomorrow, on Sunday. You have the time to fill in this question. Everything we received today, all the questions, we could not answer them all, but we will assess this. And we are going to publish this. So do not hesitate to send us our remarks or your comments through Slido. Thank you for the whole team and for the OIA, for these different offices, and for the people of national planning and OAI. I wish you all to get home safely from the office to the kitchen. Have a nice weekend. And this is a good conclusion for this year. All the best.